Thank you for making a point to be here tonight. I want to start off in a text that we're not going to spend our time in, but it sets up for us where we're going to be. Uh, so go ahead and open up to Genesis chapter 16, and we're going to start here. You're probably familiar with Abraham and Sarah, and you're probably familiar with uh, Hagar, Sarah's handmaiden. In Genesis chapter 16, we see the relationship and perhaps the lack of trust in Abraham's promise that God had made to him. Abraham, if you leave this place, or Abram, if you leave this place, I'm going to make you a great nation. That's what God said. And of your descendants, they'll be as numerous as the stars and like sand on the seashore. They will not be able to be counted. Well, 10 years later, he still didn't have any children. So Sarai takes Hagar, as was her right, and gave it to Abram. And the problem with that is that Hagar conceived a child. And then she began to look with contempt on Sarah. But then we see in Genesis 16 and verse 6, where we're going to start reading the background here. Sarah dealt harshly with her. But Abram said to Sarai, "Behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please." Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she fled from her. So Hagar leaves the house as a slave does. She runs away. And then we see in verse 7, as the story continues to unfold, let's just read this together to get to where we are going. The angel of the Lord found her by the spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, "Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going?" She said, "I am fleeing from my mistress Sarai." The angel of the Lord said to her, "Return to your mistress and submit to her." The angel of the Lord also said to her, "I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude." And the angel of the Lord said to her, "Behold, you are pregnant, and you shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen." Then in verse 13, where we're getting to. So she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, "You are a God of seeing." For she said, "Truly, here I have seen him who looks after me." Therefore, the well was called Bir Lahairoi. It lies between Kadesh and Bered. A God who sees. You are a God who sees. Fast forward a decade and a half, give or take a few years, and you're in Genesis chapter 21. And that's where we are going to spend our time that we have together. After the events of her fleeing and her encounter with the angel in Genesis chapter 21, again, about 15 years, give or take, later, there is another instance where we see that this is a God who sees. We're gonna start and we're gonna read some more. So just bear with me and hang with me, and then we'll get into this. Okay, let's begin in verse 8, and then we're gonna read through verse 21. I know it's a lot. Just better God than me. Okay, and the child grew and was weaned. This is after Isaac was born. The child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian whom she bore to Abraham, laughing. So she said to Abraham, cast out this slave woman with her son. For the son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac. And the thing was very displeasing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, be not displeased because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for through Isaac shall your offspring be named. And I will make a nation, verse 13, of the son of the slave woman also, because he is your offspring. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she put the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot. For she said, let me not look on the death of the child. And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the boy. And the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what troubles you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Up, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make him into a great nation. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water, and she went and filled the skin of water and gave the boy a drink. And God was with the boy, and he grew up, and he lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. Now you have the rest of the story. But this is an interesting, at least putting these two side by side and skipping the chapters in between, it gives you an interesting concept when Hagar, on two different occasions, had conversations with an angel of the Lord, both times in the wilderness. Fascinating to me. That's where we're spending our time, because what you see and what Hagar undoubtedly, unquestionably knew is that God was watching over her. And that is comforting. It's comforting to know that God knew her name. That God even knew her name. And I don't know if that baffles your mind or not, but half the time you're walking through the door, and this is me and my finite brain, and I'm like, blah, 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 you, hey, you. And even today, when we were eating lunch, I was like, Ellie, Esther, Amos, what's your name? Ellie. But there's a God who knows your name. And God knows the name, and this is an insignificant person, right? In the history of, she's a slave, right? I mean, in verse 12 and verse 13, if you picked it up, God is speaking to Abraham, and he doesn't even call her by name. All he says is twice, the slave woman, right? She's just a slave woman. She is on the totem pole of society. She is at the bottom, right? So there's the patriarchs, right? And then at the top, and then under them are slaves, and then the females. Like, we are going all the way down to the very bottom. But even though she was a slave, God knows her name. That's exciting to me. That when I think about myself as nothing, that God still cares about me enough to know my name. That's pretty neat. And you also see, like, not only is she just a slave, but she had no part of the promise. Like the promise that God had to Abraham of that I'm going to make a mighty and great nation of you, that had nothing to do with Hagar. In fact, it all hinged on Sarah. And then I guess another part of that is that Hagar was a continuous representation of their lack of faith, a demonstration of their lack of faith. But all of this comes back to the point that they didn't trust God. They didn't know God. They didn't care about how God was going to do things. They wanted to do it, but God still cared about them and that God still loved them. She was trying to run away in chapter 16. I'm running away. I've been treated poorly and I'm running. And here she's been sent away in chapter 21. Sarah says, "Get out." Her and her son, Ishmael's probably 14 to 17, somewhere around there. Probably closer to 17, maybe even a little bit older. And now all of a sudden she's told, leave. But although she was a slave, and although she had no part in the promise, and although she was a manifestation of Abraham and Sarah's lack of faith, God still knows her name. And even more than that, He calls her by name. He calls her by name. That's pretty special, to be called by name. So that's the first thing, that, that God knew her name. God is a God who sees. And this God called her by name. And He's also, obviously, from both of these situations, He's a God who understands the situation that is at hand. He understands what's going on. And here, He understood the dynamics of this, what had become a pretty twisted household, right? I mean, can you see the friction in the house? And God knew all of that. God was very well aware of the situation that was at hand. And as you look at that situation of Hagar, it's what? Well, in verse 10, she's been disowned, right? She's been cast out, she's disowned, and then she finds herself absolutely destitute without any necessities of life. In fact, verse 15 and verse 16 tells us that she went and sat her son down under a bush or under a tree, whatever it is, a shrub of some sort, and she goes about that far so that she can die, so that her son can die. Destitute. Right? So this is the situation of Hagar. Right? This is how she finds herself in. She is disowned, a slave that's been disowned, and now she's at the bottom of the bottom of the bottom of the bottom of the barrel with nothing. She's about to die. And knowing all that, right? If you can't find humor in the Bible, you're not looking hard enough. Or maybe it's just a twisted mind that can find it. Because knowing the situation, look at what God says. And God heard, this is verse 17, and God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What troubles you, Hagar?" Are you kidding me? Like, yeah, you know my name, you see what's going on, and yet you have the audacity to say, "What troubles you? What bothers you?" But this, in verse 17 and 18, what follows, shows you how God responds to her situation, which is interesting when you step back and you see it, because He knows, right? He knows what's going on. But He begins with the question. Right? He questions her. What troubles you? What troubles you? And then there's a very important point that he adds. As far as we know, it's probably been about 15 years since she had a last conversation with an angel. And he says, "What troubles you, Hagar? What troubles you? I know who you are. I remember you. But what troubles you?" Now, what that does is it makes her think, doesn't it? Why am I so worried? Why am I so anxious? What is really bothering me? So God begins with the question, what troubles you? And then you see again, still in verse 17, he gives the command. He begins with the question, what troubles you, Hagar? The command, fear not, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Fear not. What troubles you, Hagar? I know you. I see you. I know what's going on. Do not fear. There's a lot of comfort just hearing the word, do not fear, isn't there? Just to know that someone sees that you have reason to fear. And then they say, more or less, it's going to be okay. The little child gets hurt learning to ride their bike. They fall over, cut up and bloody, and they come crying to you, and your response is, what's the matter? Followed by, it's going to be okay. We have the same response, and we give the same response that God does because we know that it's going to be okay. We know that, yeah, you're probably going to get a little bloody learning to ride your bike. That's just part of it. But once you do it, you've accomplished something that you're never going to learn or you're never going to forget. So it's going to be okay. Do not fear. Fear not. Although she had plenty of reasons to fear, he tells her to fear not because he knows something. And it's interesting as you see this continue to unfold, he questions her and he commands her, and then the end of it in verse 17, he says, "Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is." Now, a few points to remember here. God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Now, if you back up and you look at verse 16, who is it that's crying? Who is the one that is weeping the bitter tears? She is. And God, twice in verse 17, God heard the boy. God heard the boy. I don't know the significance of that, but I will tell you that God knows and hears even when we don't say words. The other thing that's interesting about this is God hears the voice of the boy where he is. You tried to hide him under the bush, maybe to give him shade protection, maybe from protection from the animals or whatever that's going to come, the heat or whatever. But God knows where he is, and God hears him. There's a lot of peace when we pray, isn't there? When we pray to a God who sees and know that he hears us. Yeah, when we're crying those tears, but he hears us even where we are. Maybe we're trying to hide. God hears us. And then in verse 18, perhaps the most important part of this conversation, fear not, I've heard the boy. Verse 18, he reminds her of the promise. Up, lift up the boy, hold him fast with your hand, for I will make him into a great nation. That's the promise that he gave for the first time back in chapter 16. I will make him into a great nation. Not only does that tell Hagar that he's going to survive this, he's going to thrive, and he's going to be very successful, and he's going to flourish. All this Hagar had forgotten. She knew it. I mean, I'm sure she probably thought about it in the past 15 years, but apparently she forgot. How easy it is. Here's your application. How easy it is when times get tough to forget the promises of God. When we are destitute, when we are in the pits of life, it's easy to forget who God is, what He's done for us, and what He's promised to do. Let's look at this next thing. He knows your name, He knows the situation, what's going on, and He also knows your needs. Obviously, the needs of Hagar right now are water, shelter, a new home. He knows those things. But more importantly, she was dying. You see that? Because she, that's what her intention was to do. It seems from all points from the scripture that her purpose was to die. I'm going to set this boy down over here so I don't have to listen to him die, and then I'm going to go over there and I'm going to die myself. She was dying. She was helpless. Verse 16. Then she went and sat down opposite him a good way off. And her helpless statement, let me not look on the death of the child. Hopeless. Helplessly hopeless. There was nothing that she could do. She was weak. She was without strength. See that in verse 19? Because God commands her. She couldn't carry her son anymore. But then she's commanded to take up this boy. Her greatest problem was not physical, it wasn't mental, it wasn't emotional. The greatest problem was spiritual and forgetting God. God had already said these things in verse 18. He already told her these promises. She forgot. She forgot God. How do you help someone who is dying without hope and weak? Show them God. And when you show them God, that He has died for your sin, that He gives you hope, that He gives you strength, that person can all of a sudden live again. We serve a God who sees. And I don't know about you, but alone in the desert, it seems like a familiar landscape to me. And in desperate need of God. But there is a God who sees. He knows my name. He knows my situation. And He cares for me. And He cares for you too. What are you going to do about it? Are you living right? Are you living for Him? He sees you. He knows you. Will you respond appropriately to Him seeing you. If you're subject to the invitation in any way, let me invite you to come forward as we stand.